And I think your next question was, what are the possibilities within the law to provide maybe even somewhat of a check and balance on what may be the next administration, and a check and balance on industry, putting maybe politics aside. What role the law might have to protect people's rights and to protect the environment. And I think it's a little bit it's definitely there's a give and take relationship. So while we like to see the courts as as a check and balance on our legislature and on our administrative, or our president and the administration, the legislature obviously has an impact on the courts. So they pass laws, and they say things about, for example, whether there's a new TSCA bill. So there's a new toxic substances bill that Congress passed, and during the discussion and the politics back and forth on amendments to that bill, one of the things that they wanted to do, and I would say that the more, we could say, Republicans or conservatives in the House and in the Senate wanted to pass provisions within that bill that would what's called preempt lawsuits. Mm-hmm. So if the EPA said, for example, that Roundup does not cause cancer, despite the fact that any other, that scientists at universities thought it caused cancer, that scientists in Europe or scientists at the World Health Organization thought that it caused cancer, if the EPA were to say that Roundup does not cause cancer in their view, then there would have been a provision in TSCA that was put in place that would prevent anyone from suing Monsanto for getting cancer that they believed was from Roundup, even if they had a list of scientists and support to show it, if the EPA did not agree. And so that's a very clear example where the administration and the politics really can influence what role the courts and individual lawyers and lawsuits can have to bring about justice. Now, luckily, that provision did not end up in the final TSCA bill, but there are, with the change in administration, with the latest election results where the House and the Senate are both under control of generally of those people that would like to put those provisions in place, there are certainly possibilities in the near future that are the rights and roles, the rights of citizens and the roles of the courts could be severely restricted based on actions taken by Congress and by the president that would really limit people's rights to go into court, to argue scientifically, not with junk science or anything else, but to argue scientifically that they've been injured or that they have some impact based on an exposure to a pesticide like Roundup or glyphosate, or if we look back at fracking. So if the EPA passed regulations on fracking, they could say, well, as long as you're in compliance with those regulations, it doesn't matter what you do above and beyond that. And so the legislature could really work to take away the interpretation by the courts of individual rights. So we looked at photos, and I showed you photos, and I think the point of those photos, if nothing else, is that maybe their water is still good, maybe there's no evidence that they've gotten cancer, but they certainly have lost their property rights. And it's those types of things that if the EPA comes out with a set of regulations and says, well, when you want to go and hydraulically frack for natural gas or for oil, these are the things that you need to do. If you do them, you get a shield to any lawsuit. And that's essentially what these preemption opinions will do. And that will severely restrict the role of people like me and the role of individual voices and the role of juries who can look at those photos and look at those facts and say, well, gee whiz, I understand that we want to have energy independence, and I understand that we want to have natural gas for people's homes, but we need to balance that with the rights of people and individuals who own property and who have worked their entire lives to invest their life savings in their home and their homestead. And so there is definitely an opportunity for lawyers and for legal actions, not just lawsuits, but other legal actions. That being said, I think there's a real interplay between the three branches of government. And when you have such dominance in the two branches with the new president-elect, and with the new, the reinforced Republican House and Senate, those opportunities may be severely limited. And I think, that's just one example of where people vote and engage in elections, but fail to see the real outcomes that may, that impact real people, in very specific situations in their neighborhoods, and in their, in their property rights, in their right to clean air, and their right to clean water, and so on and so forth. So, I think there is some opportunity there. I think it's an uphill battle now, especially given the politics in this country. But I think the more people understand that there are people and their efforts to take away those rights, and the more people recognize that those rights are in jeopardy based on, certain political ideologies, that people maybe have a better interest in voting and an interest in raising their voice, if not for a party or a certain policy, certainly for the rights of people to breathe clean air, to drink clean water, and to have a planet that our children and grandchildren can survive on.
Great. So we're going to move from this section to I think the audience has several questions, actually. So I'm going to start in the order that I believe I received them. So the first is from Dennis, who asks, who decides what constitutes reasonable use of the surface when a third party owns the mineral rights?
So if you ask me, my hope is that a jury decides that, right? So the way the law is set up, and the way that it currently is, the question of reasonable use of the surface would be based on what a jury would interpret would be reasonable. And so, for example, with fracking, what we see is that a lot of times what will happen, I was out on a gentleman's, a guy owned two hilltops on the same mountain, sort of two crests on the same mountain. One of them was where he had his sheep, and the other was where he had his pasture to grow the grass to feed the sheep. And the Chesapeake Energy had come, they had a mineral lease, and they had come and taken over where his pasture was, and they leveled his pasture. They put gravel and cement on top of the pasture, and they had 5 fracking wells, so 5 natural gas wells that they drilled and were fracking. And what they do with these frack wells is they don't just go down 5,000 feet, but they go down and they go horizontally, right? And so what they were doing was they're not necessarily fracking natural gas that's below his property. They're fracking natural gas that's below other people's property, but it's a lot easier for them and much more efficient for them in terms of their manpower, in terms of the traffic and the trucking, in terms of their staffing and having people located in one spot, to have everybody working on this one location, despite the fact that they're gathering they're gathering gas from these 5 different locations that are spread around maybe for a mile or more in different areas, right? So what they're doing is they're using, in that case, they're using this poor farmer's land to harvest natural gas from 5, maybe let's say one of those wells is from his land, and then 4 other properties, but they're using, they have five times the operation on his property because they have a right to use his property. And so I would argue to a jury, and that's who would decide. I would say, well, that's not reasonable. It's reasonable for them maybe to have a drilling rig there to drill the well, to produce the well, to frack the well, and then have 2 tanks to store the gas and to store the condensate. But to have 5 times that operation so that they can receive natural gas from 4 other people's properties, I would say is totally unreasonable. But again, that question, the simple answer to your question is that under the law currently, that question should be answered generally by a jury. The point that I was making at the end of that last question is that the legislature, the state legislatures and or the federal government could pass laws that say we're going to define reasonable use in a certain way. And if they were to do that, that takes away the rights of people, I think, to to apply a local standard, a peer standard through the jury system that says, okay, well, what's reasonable? Well, this is what they did. They came in at 4 a.m. They cut down the fence, they made all this noise. They left the lights on 24 hours. Now that's unreasonable, right? Another jury might come out a different way, but that's the beauty of the jury system where, everybody has an opinion and, hopefully those opinions reflect the appropriate standard for the locality.
Great. Let's move on to the next question from Kurt. So he asks, how's it going for under-resourced communities being able to get legal representation and justice? Or put another way, do some lawsuits play out as wealthy NIMBY pushing the development towards less fortunate communities? What advice would you give to college-age youth?
That seems like 2.5 at least questions, but the first question, with respect to underserved or the poor communities, that's a huge issue. What you see, whether you call it environmental justice, whether you call it, there are some people that would like to say that it's racism. Personally, I think it has to do with money. It has to do with power. It has to do with being connected. It has to do with, having or not having a voice in local politics, in national politics. So what I see, as the question sort of implies, is that there are a lot of people that are poor, communities that are poor that may live off the land. I mean, the example in West Virginia, I think, with the sheep farmer was one. I mean, everything he owned was in that sheep farm. And so, the problem, and I'll say, I'll give you an example. Fracking is actually a great example. So fracking, you go into rural parts of Pennsylvania, rural parts of West Virginia, and you have people whose property is relatively low value. You have people whose homes are relatively low value. And one of the problems with the law, the types of lawsuits that I do for the most part, is that they're really, the way that a lawyer gets paid, I mean, a lawyer could either be paid, $200, $300, $400, $500 an hour, which no person can afford, right? So that's cost prohibitive. Or they're paid based on the value of their case. Well, if I go out to a community on the top of a mountainside in West Virginia, and they have some mobile homes parked on top of a few acres of land, their property may only be worth, $100,000 or $200,000, but it's in terms of dollar value, right? But to those families, that property is worth, everything that they have. Right. And the problem is that for me to represent them, I need to represent a dollar value loss, right? So for me to come in and spend my time to hire experts that cost money, that come from big cities that don't charge, that charge relatively lots of money, and everything else to do the testing to prove those kind of cases, a lot of times, for lack of a better word, trumps the value of those pieces of property. And so, you have a system that really disadvantages poor people, right? They don't own much. So, I know they can't pay out of pocket, but then you say, okay, well, what kind of collateral do you have? And unfortunately for people that don't have much, their collateral may be their property, but it's not worth that much. So typically you bring a lawsuit and you say, well, you took the first 5 acres of my land, and so my property value has gone down, 50%. Well, if the property value started at $150,000 and now it's down 50%, we're talking about a home run in a lawsuit being $75,000 recovery. And I've got to work, for years and years to bring about that recovery. I've got to hire 2, 3, 4 experts and spend, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 out of pocket. And you get to a point where, putting aside, even my own paycheck, which is a factor, but not the only factor, you end up with a situation where, if I want to do a job to get some money for me to run a business, but B, more importantly, to get money for the client, to get them some compensation for their loss, it becomes very difficult. The profit margins become very tight. And so, even in the context of these types of lawsuits, like if I could go to that community in Ohio that I showed you that slide, where you've got, 5,000, 6,000 square foot homes, and they've got these, drilling rigs next to them. That's going to be a lot easier to file a lawsuit. You're going to have a lot more lawyers that are engaged in that situation, because they see, okay, well, these are $500,000-$600,000 homes, and if we say they're devalued by 40%, and there's 10 of those homes, you can do the math and say, well, that's $1 million case, right? So there is a big disadvantage, and I try my best to represent people that are in these situations. I try to come up with ways to approach lawsuits where there may be another claim that gives me attorney fee claim from the defendant. But the reality is that if you don't have money, if you don't have a voice in politics, it's very difficult. And while I try, and there are nonprofits that certainly try, being underrepresented in all those other ways, in terms of paychecks, in terms of politics, in the court system, that same thing applies. I mean, I was listening today, NPR said Donald Trump is either named or, as a plaintiff or a defendant, and I think 4,000 lawsuits currently. I think certainly money provides access to courts. And this context is no different. But all that being said, to get maybe to a shade of the second and third questions there still is hope. I mean, I have had success. I've represented some very poor communities against some very big companies, and I have had success. So it's not, it's not that there's no opportunity. It's just the laws are not in favor of, of rushing into these poor communities and representing them. And unfortunately, I don't think that's going to change.
Okay. Sobering thoughts. So I'm going to come back to you with a couple of follow-up questions, and they're from two different, I'm just folding two questions into one. One question from Kokila. She says, do you see an increase in lawsuits and environmental issues in recent years? And Kurt has a follow-up question, which is basically saying, can big nonprofits step in to fund otherwise cost-prohibitive cases? So basically, what is a strategy for using lawsuits?
So that's actually both questions, and I think it's a very interesting issue. So number one, do I see an increase in lawsuits as far as the environment goes? I would say generally, and in some sense ironically, I actually see fewer suits now. With respect to my profession, which is generally, so most of what I do is civil lawsuits. So I represent, like I said, I represent people who have lost a part of their property, or it's now contaminated, they have to clean it up, or they're sick because it's been contaminated. And so I file civil lawsuits, and I try to get them money, and I get paid if they win, essentially. And those types of lawsuits, so if we think of, depending on how old you are, if you've seen the movies Aaron Brockovich or A Civil Action, if you've heard about Aaron Brockovich, those types of lawsuits were quite popular 10, 15 years ago, around the time of those movies. There were a lot of lawyers that thought that they would, get rich by filing those lawsuits. And at the same time, be it their first or second priority, they would help some people. Unfortunately, the court system has gotten more and more restrictive as far as how it is to prove those types of lawsuits. So if I go into court and I need to try and prove that my client was 4 years old and he got leukemia from some exposure, the standards for doing that have gotten very, very difficult. And so those types of lawsuits have fallen out of favor within the legal community. They're just very difficult. They're extremely risky. They're extremely costly. The way I generally describe it is they're the most expensive, riskiest lawsuits that you can file. And so, when you think about a business and you think about what you want to do to try and get a paycheck, the riskiest, most expensive thing is probably not the thing that you want to pursue. Now, the flip side is that, there are nonprofits, and nonprofits do good work and they do file litigation in certain circumstances. Now, that being said, it's typically statutory lawsuits, so Clean Air Act lawsuits, Clean Water Act lawsuits, and they have, they have great outcomes, not just for the big picture environment, but they also have very localized effects where they improve the waterways, they improve the air quality, and so on and so forth. So those lawsuits do occur, but the reality is, I think, that just like the hurdles have gotten bigger for people like me trying to file lawsuits for individuals and community members, those nonprofits are facing similar challenges in the court system. So there's funding for groups like Sierra Club and Earth Justice and Waterkeeper Alliance, and I do work with a lot of nonprofits as well. Food and Water Watch does some litigation, but I would say the same challenges of the court system. The court system is despite the way it's intended to be, it's highly politicized. I had a lawsuit where I represented Waterkeeper Alliance in a nonprofit lawsuit, right? So a Clean Water Act lawsuit, and during the litigation, the governor of the state of Maryland came out with a statement against the litigation. So, he was, and we did a FOIA request. We received emails back and forth between the defendant, which was a chicken company, Purdue, emailing back and forth with the governor, smiley faces, saying, how did you like that when he put out this statement? So even when you think you get into court, you've got a righteous case, you're representing a nonprofit, you're not trying to make anyone, fill anyone's pocketbook, and the governor of the state is beholden to the industry. And quite literally, in a way that we were able to uncover through these private emails, it's a very difficult challenge. But again, I mean, there was a question I think that Kurt had asked that I didn't ever come back to, which is, what do I recommend to young people, and what hope is there? I mean, this is, unfortunately, these are fights that we need to have, whether or not we think that we can win them. I mean, there are victories, and you can have victories, and quite frankly, you can make a living doing some of this stuff, whether it's as a nonprofit or whether it's as a private attorney, like I am. But the fights are not easy, and the fights will not get easier. In fact, they'll probably, certainly in the near future, get even more difficult. But I think the key, and not to get, but I think the key is really to continue the fight, so that that we don't lose completely. I mean, the little victories are what counts, and when we get those little victories, those are what propel us to move on and to file more of these lawsuits and try and get people's voices heard.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, these are sobering thoughts, and I think in the times that we're in, it's important to recognize that we are facing very tough challenges, right? That it's not, hooray, we will win and there will be a victory march, but that it's going to be a long, hard slog, and the system is biased against those who suffer the most.
Unfortunately, that's right.
So let me channel a couple of more questions. So one from Robert Dyson. Thanks, Robert. So Robert has been with us for all our sessions. So, here's his question. He says his main question has been answered, but worse than I thought. I saw the EPA as being weakened, but it seems that it may be used as a weapon. With glyphosate, it's not just cancer risk, but soil destruction and tying people into an unsustainable system. Is it true that already Monsanto is not responsible for damage in the past? I have a barrister friend, so Robert is in England, so he uses the word barrister. So I have a barrister friend who explained a case to me recently where he used some ancient law about right to light to object to some monster development. Can new laws override such?
That's so the issues with glyphosate. So the EPA, the IARC, the leading World Health Organization division on cancer, as interagency on research of cancer, came out and said glyphosate Roundup was a probable human carcinogen, and they put that out. And immediately Monsanto went to work to try and lobby those in Europe and to try and lobby those at the EPA to say, no, they don't agree with this. The EPA came out with a draft statement. They posted it online, basically saying that, no, it wasn't carcinogenic. And then they withdrew that within the same day. So there's all kinds of politics that are going on with a powerful company like Monsanto that's playing out in Europe, and that's playing out within the EPA on this question of cancer. But you bring up other issues where you have the farmers that are beholden. So what happens with Roundup, and particularly with Roundup Ready crops, is that Monsanto sells the seeds. The farmers grow the seeds. They're not allowed to store the seeds. The seeds, and they germinate and they spread to other farms. So if you have an organic farmer that's next to a GMO farmer, and the GMO seed spreads to the organic farm, there have been several cases where Monsanto has shown up, found the GMO crop across the street, and sued the farmer for growing their GMO crop without their license to do so, right? Through no fault of the farmer. And actually, this organic farmer or this natural farmer is trying to farm without the use of Monsanto's GMO seeds for their reasons, and certainly their rights to do so. And yet they're becoming the victim of a lawsuit. Again, the farmer that's chosen to work with Monsanto is now beholden to Monsanto because they're not allowed to keep the seed. They have to keep buying the seed from Monsanto. Then they buy the Roundup from Monsanto. Then they soak their crops with that Roundup from Monsanto. And what we're now finding is that those crops, and as you would expect it, those crops are so heavily dosed with Roundup that things like Quaker Oats right now, they're finding high levels of glyphosate or Roundup in Quaker Oats, in I think Cheerios might have been recently, they found it in Cheerios. So these things that we don't expect to see, pesticides down through the food chain, because Roundup doesn't negatively affect the crop because it's been engineered to withstand the Roundup, they can use excessive amounts of Roundup. It goes through the processing and it gets down to the food chain. It gets down to, even those highly processed foods that we get at the grocery store these days. And so there are real issues. Now, you asked this question about whether we can use these new laws. I mean, we're always looking for clever ways to address, to put a new solution to an old problem. And one of the things, for example, I mean, you bring up this law. I don't know anything about the access to light, but it sounds like a bit like a nuisance or a development law. One of the things that we're looking at currently right now and is to sue like the Quaker Oats, and we're testing foods. So we're sending foods out that we get from the shelf of Walmart or Safeway or Giant, testing them for glyphosate, and then suing those manufacturers for not revealing the fact that there's glyphosate within their product. So if you buy honey, for example, and the honey will say 100% natural honey, you can test some of that honey, and some of the honey actually shows that it's got glyphosate in it, right? And so we're bringing these consumer protection laws that don't typically apply to these environmental type issues, bringing these consumer protection lawsuits to say, hey, this says 100% honey, it says 100% natural, and it's got this synthetic manufactured pesticide in there, and we want that out, right? Or we want that revealed. And certainly there are people that aren't going to want to buy the honey if it's not 100% natural, and in fact, it's got pesticides in it. So, there are some clever ways, and in fact, some of those ways are, you always have to be, it's a dance, right? You always have to come up with a new move, because these industries and the legislators and the politicians that protect those industries will adapt, and they will take away those things that are successful. So you need to come up with new approaches and new solutions. And I think this consumer protection angle is one of them that we're coming up with that, doesn't sound like an environmental lawsuit, but it's something that, has a way to feed back into environmental issues.
That's great. I mean, I think that we could probably go on forever along these lines. And, I know that you would much rather be talking to us than to be fighting your lawsuits, but I'm going to, all good things come to an end, and it's 12:56. So if there's a final question from the audience, we can take that. Robert says, very useful and inspiring presentation. Yes, bring Chris back. So we will bring Chris back. And I'm hoping that bad things come to an end too. Well, we are with you, Robert. So any final thoughts, Chris?
Well, the one thing that I'll say, I mean, after, being, I think the reality is sobering. I don't think there's any denying of that. But I think as far as career choices, as far as, the more people that think about the career that they're either entering into or the career that they've been 5 or 10 years into, and they think about the things that they want to leave their children, the way they want to leave the planet, the mark that they want to have in their community. We need more people to go out and to fight some of these battles. And you don't have to be a lawyer to do that. You can be an organizer. You can work for a nonprofit. You can work for an energy company that's developing clean energy, that's developing alternatives. So you want to, fight in the marketplace, right? The capitalist solution is I don't so much believe in fighting from within, because I tried that. I don't think working at ExxonMobil is going to steer that giant ship in a way that is good for the future. But I do think that, working to make solar companies competitive with and wind companies competitive with fossil fuel companies is the way to beat them at their own game. And so it's not, I would much rather be an engineer than be a lawyer. If there are engineering solutions for some of these problems, I think those are as important, if not more important, than lawsuits. My job right now is to try and push back on these companies so that they're forced to make the investment in the engineering solutions and to create the opportunities for people like Elon Musk and other people to develop those engineering solutions so that there's a market for them, and that these highly subsidized fossil fuel and environment destroying companies don't get a free pass. So my job is to push back on them, and I welcome anyone else's effort to that job. But I think the reality is, at the end of the day, we need better solutions on the engineering and science front to really open the door to those things that we want to achieve in the future, but that we want to achieve without destroying our planet and our health at the same time.
Well, with that, thank you very much, Chris. This was the last episode of the first hive, and so with any luck, we'll have more episodes of the second hive, in which Chris will tell us about other things that he's fighting. And in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. And Mark, do you want to say a couple words to finish us off here?
Just thank you very much, Chris. It was really fascinating, and we really appreciate you taking the time. And I think we'll definitely, if you're available, we'd love to get you back.
Sounds good. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you.